I heard my wife telling her friend that her boss was better than me. She didn't expect me to be listening to their conversation, hidden behind the hallway door, my heart racing as if I were facing an abyss about to swallow me. And maybe he was. There, standing there, listening to muffled laughter, whispered compliments with a certain glow of pleasure, I realized that something inside me had broken definitively. She spoke quietly, like someone confiding a dirty secret, but her friend, perhaps without the same guilt, laughed louder. And in that laugh, I understood everything. It wasn't just an innocent comparison. It was desire. It was provocation. It was disdain. The way she talked about him, the way her voice changed when she said her boss's name, as if she contained a repressed orgasm, was enough to tear me apart. They weren't just words, it wasn't a misplaced phrase. It was confirmation of a truth that, for some time, I had refused to see. I took 2 steps back, leaned against the wall and closed my eyes trying to process it. But her voice continued, like a knife turning through flesh. He knows exactly what I like, unlike someone who only pretends to know. The friend said, "Wow, friend," and I felt as if they were talking about a man other than me, as if I had never been part of that house, that body, that bed. I lay there, motionless, breathing hard, listening to every syllable and trying not to fall apart. They didn't know I was home. They had planned a coffee in the late afternoon, but the service released it ahead of schedule. I arrived an hour early. And it was the exact time I needed for my world to fall apart. They were unaware of the presence of my cell phone in my pocket, with the recorder on from the moment I heard the first strange sentence. I had already noticed a certain distance in the last few months, but nothing compared to that moment of derision. "He looks at me as if I were art," she said. "With my husband it's different, he just touches me as if it were habit." The friend tried to put things into perspective, "But you have been together for years, it's normal." And she replied ironically, "Normal? So tell me why I came with him just from a kiss on the neck." The silence afterward told me everything. I was no longer her man. Maybe it never would have been. Maybe it was just a stepping stone until she found what she thought she deserved. I left the house without making any noise. No confrontation, no scene. I needed time. Time to feel the pain, to shape my fury, to create something equal to what I was experiencing. My heart told me to break everything, scream, destroy. But reason, cold and strategic, whispered, give back with elegance, with silent cruelty, with the pain of the naked truth being exposed before everyone. I came back the next day as if nothing had happened. She welcomed me with a shy kiss, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps because her body was already somewhere else. I made dinner, opened some wine, and when she asked the reason for my sudden attention, I smiled and just said, "You deserve it." And she, in her blind vanity, believed. For weeks, I prepared every detail. I didn't tell anyone, I didn't cry in front of anyone, I didn't drink a single drop of alcohol. I was sober in suffering and surgical in planning. I gathered audios, collected old conversations, intercepted WhatsApp messages on her forgotten laptop. I had everything I needed at hand, dates, places, words spoken on sheets that weren't ours. And then I knew, it wasn't enough to just ask for a divorce. It was little. It was mediocre. She needed to feel. Feeling the bitter taste of being exposed, the embarrassment of seeing yourself small in front of those you have always admired. And I needed that. Not for revenge, but for justice. For everything I donated. For everything she threw away. I planned the date, the wedding anniversary. A dinner with your closest friends, co-workers, family, all gathered in an elegant restaurant. Invitations sent, everything prepared with care, as if it were a celebration. And she, vain, chose the best dress, did her nails, bought new heels. I was beaming, believing that I was still the fool in love I always was. And I went. The most romantic, the most attentive, the most dedicated. Until the exact moment I raised the glass and asked for everyone's attention. Today we celebrate love. Or what's left of it. Because what we celebrate, in truth, is freedom. Mine. And hers. The freedom to take off our masks and reveal who we really are. A silence fell. Everyone looked at me. She smiled, still thinking it was part of an emotional speech. And then I pressed the button on the projector's remote control. The screen lit up. And the audio started. Every sentence, every laugh, every groan of betrayal. Played for an entire room. She turned pale. He tried to get up. But a friendly hand held her, asking her to wait. And waited. She waited while everyone heard the words she never imagined would come out of that room, from that innocent afternoon of coffee and secrets. Then, silence. The kind of silence that deafens. Looks crossing the table. The friend, in shock, not knowing where to put her face. And she, curled up, her face stained with shame. So I finished. Happy wedding anniversary. You're free now. So am I. The lawyer has the papers ready. And yes, this was all premeditated. I left the envelope on the table and left. Without looking back. Not a tear. Just the bitter taste of who did what needed to be done. But what she didn't know was that her fall was just beginning. The lover, the much idolized boss, would receive a copy of the audios along with an anonymous letter. And the company, strict about ethics, would not be complacent with a scandal between superiors and subordinates. The lover, faced with pressure, would deny everything, placing all the blame on her. And she would pay the price. But what surprised me most was not her reaction, nor her lover's cowardice. That's what happened weeks later. A turn of events that not even in my most vengeful plans would I have imagined. Something that completely changed the way I saw everything I experienced. A discovery that not only amplified my pain, but revealed a hidden detail, a detail that, to this day, makes me question, who, in fact, was the real traitor in this story. And that's exactly where everything changes. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal, on the contrary. The stories you will hear are fictitious, but they carry profound truths about the devastating consequences of disloyalty. Our objective is clear, to show how betrayal can destroy lives, families and feelings that seemed eternal. Now take a deep breath. 'Cause what are you about to hear will shock you. Get ready for an intense story. Gabriel was always the type of man who was content with little, but offered everything. Not out of accommodation, but out of principle. The son of simple parents, he grew up learning that love was not in big demonstrations, but in small gestures, a cup of coffee before the other woke up, a hand on the back after a difficult day, complicit silence when tired. From an early age, he carried within him a silent and, at the same time, firm sense of responsibility. He worked with technology in a medium-sized company and lived a routine that many might call common, but for him it was, in fact, the security he wanted. He didn't need euphoria, he needed stability. Clara appeared in his life at a time when he did not expect changes. She was extroverted, determined, driven by an elegant restlessness. Unlike him, she wasn't afraid to show herself, to speak loudly when necessary, to complain when something bothered her. She came from a dysfunctional home, marked by absences and broken promises, which made her demanding and, at the same time, sensitive to the most genuine gestures. Clara was thirsty to be seen, to be noticed, and Gabriel, with his restrained and observant way, saw her deeply. That's what won her over. Not the expensive gifts or the meticulously planned trips, but the way he listened to her, as if her every word deserved to be remembered. They got married after 3 years of dating. The beginning of their life together was marked by an adaptation full of sweetness. Gabriel, methodical, organized every detail of the house. Clear, spontaneous, she transformed the environment with touches of color and improvisation. At first, they laughed at the differences. He made lists for the market, she forgot half of what she needed to buy. He preferred to sleep early, she loved binge-watching series until the early hours. But between one conflict and another, they learned to respect each other. The routine was installed in a subtle, almost imperceptible way, like someone who, without realizing it, moves furniture over time. The years passed and life took its course. Gabriel received a low-key promotion that required him to spend more time at home dealing with remote teams. Clara, in turn, immersed herself in the executive advisory work she dreamed of. She began to grow, being praised for her organization and emotional intelligence. His work environment was fast-paced, competitive, made up of meetings with directors, confidential projects and aggressive goals. She flourished there. He lived in a constant state of alert, as if he couldn't let his guard down for a single second. It left her exhausted, but at the same time it fueled a feeling of accomplishment she had never experienced. Gabriel, proud, encouraged her. He never tried to prune it or reduce its shine. On the contrary, she made a point of telling her friends how talented and admired she was. Nights at home became quieter. She arrived later. He was already eating dinner. They still kissed, they still shared a bed, but now the topics were more practical: bills, deadlines, doctors, renovations. The spontaneous laughter gave way to comfortable silences and then just silences. Gabriel felt her absence even when she was on the other side of the sofa. But he didn't say anything. I thought it was just a phase. Maybe he was the one too tired to start a conversation. Maybe it was Clara's new rhythm. Maybe it was just time, which sculpted intimacy in a more contained way after so many years. Weekends were still moments of relief. They went shopping together, sometimes watched movies, had friends over. But there was something in her eyes that he couldn't name. A subtle, almost imperceptible distance, as if part of it were somewhere else even though it was present. Gabriel, intuitive as he always was, noticed the change before it even showed itself. He didn't know what it was. There was no clear reason, just a lingering feeling that something had changed between them. Like someone who feels the wind change before the rain. And yet, he kept trying. He made her coffee like in the early years, left notes with small phrases, and on special dates, he organized simple surprises that made her smile, but the smile was short-lived. As if the gesture was nice, but not enough. Clara, in turn, struggled with a feeling that confused her. I knew I loved Gabriel, at least I believed that. But there was a growing restlessness within her. She felt admired by him, but she no longer felt desired. He blamed himself for this, for thinking this way. He found the thought cruel, but he insisted. Days at the office put her in contrast to independent, attractive women who were certain of what they wanted. And with men who praised them, who paid attention to details, who knew how to say the right words at the right times. In his head, it was just a naive, passing comparison. But as the months passed, she felt more alive outside her home than inside it. And that scared her. Gabriel was a good, patient, honest man. She knew she was lucky to have him. But she could no longer pretend that his touch caused her the same reactions as before. He was trying to convince himself it was tiredness, routine, stress. But deep down, I feared it was something deeper. Still, she tried. On social media, he posted photos smiling next to Gabriel on trips, dinners and events. Colleagues commented on how perfect a couple they were. Clara responded with heart emojis, while inside she felt a growing emptiness. Sometimes she found herself crying in the shower, without understanding exactly why. Other times, I wanted to scream. But he was silent. I believed it was just a crisis. And crises pass. One afternoon, after another tiring meeting, Clara was called in for a new project. It would be a direct partnership with the area director, a respected man, with a firm voice and a strong presence. A leader who inspired and demanded in equal measure. In the early days, she felt challenged. Then recognized. And then, something else. But she pushed the thought away. It was just professional admiration. It couldn't be more than that. Gabriel, at home, noticed the changes in her tone of voice when talking about work. An excitement he hadn't heard in a while. A glow that was previously reserved for their achievements now emerged when talking about the projects being developed with the new director. He didn't say anything. He kept every detail to himself, every variation of mood, every absence of touch. Deep down, I wanted to believe that everything was fine. That their love was strong enough to withstand the passage of time. But love alone is not enough when it stops being cultivated. And Gabriel's gestures, although sincere, no longer found space in Clara's increasingly accelerated routine. The words between them became shorter, the looks rarer. The silence, once comfortable, was now heavy. And still, they both followed. Because it was easier to continue than to face what was lost. Neither of them knew, at that moment, how much they were about to move apart in ways they could never imagine. The connection that had once been the foundation of the relationship was now a bridge with invisible cracks. And what would come next, would change everything. The following weeks brought a different rhythm to Gabriel and Clara's house, although no drastic changes were announced or even concretely perceived. It was as if something imperceptible was settling between the two, changing the frequency of their coexistence, the tone of their dialogue, the duration of their glances. Gabriel continued his usual routine, taking care of the details of the house, maintaining consistency when working remotely, but something inside him was beginning to weigh more heavily than usual. It was an uneasiness that was difficult to name, as if an invisible layer was forming between him and Clara, as if she were increasingly distant even though she was physically there. He tried to rationalize the discomfort, to convince himself that it was just the result of the accumulation of tasks, the rush of adult life, but deep down, instinct warned him that there was something he wasn't fully seeing. Clara, on the other hand, spent most of her days away from home. The demands of the new project with the director completely absorbed her. Her mornings started earlier, her nights were often longer, and she seemed increasingly immersed in a universe that Gabriel was not part of. Little by little, work dinners, after-hours meetings, and short work trips emerged that did not exist before. Gabriel, always understanding, did not question. Instead, he would prepare dinner for when she returned, even though most of the time she had already eaten. He didn't say anything, just put away the food, washed the dishes and lay down next to her when she was already sleeping, avoiding waking her with the cell phone light on. She turned over on her back in her sleep, and he learned to live with the cold on the opposite side of the bed. One night, Clara arrived visibly lighter. She was wearing a dress that Gabriel hadn't seen in a while, she had makeup on, her eyes were shining in a way he knew, but hadn't seen in a long time. She came in smiling, placed her bag on the sofa and said that the meeting had been a success, that the project was being very well received, and that she might be appointed to an even higher position. Gabriel smiled, tried to share the euphoria, praised her effort, the beauty of the dress, the sparkle in her eyes, but she had already picked up her cell phone and got lost in a conversation on WhatsApp. He stood there, still, with the praise hanging in the air and dying alone in the silent room. Gabriel began to mentally write down little things. The clothes that she previously wore only on special occasions began to appear on ordinary work days. New perfumes appeared in the bathroom. New self-care habits that he hadn't noticed before began to repeat themselves with almost choreographed frequency. He didn't want to be the kind of man who distrusted his wife. It gnawed at him. But something inside him called for vigilance. And then, one afternoon, he decided to go home early. He had a headache at work and turned off his computer in the early afternoon. He stopped at a bakery, bought her favorite cake, some flowers and returned home with the intention of surprising her, of perhaps reconnecting some thread that seemed about to break. He entered slowly, as he always did. The house was silent. There was no sign of Clara. He left the flowers on the kitchen table and called out to her twice. No response. He found it strange. He went up the stairs. The room was tidy but empty. The bathroom is dry. No sign that she had returned from work. He picked up his cell phone to call, but realized that her bag was at the entrance to the room. The cell phone too. The car key, on the sideboard. Gabriel was surprised. He called once again. He went downstairs and noticed the back door was ajar. A shiver ran down his spine. He went out into the backyard and saw the door to Clara's studio, which she occasionally used as a space to work at home, closed. He walked there in silence, feeling the air heavy with each step. He approached the door and, before knocking, he heard muffled voices. They were not ordinary voices. They were whispers interspersed with laughter, with different breathing. He stood still for a moment. The hand frozen on the doorknob. Breath holding. The throat dries up. A painful instinct told him not to go in, to go back and pretend nothing had happened, but he knew he couldn't go back any longer. He went back inside, took out his cell phone and turned on the voice recorder. He returned to the studio with almost silent steps, placed the device close to the crack in the side window, where the sound became clearer, and walked away, hearing his own heart beating so loudly that he thought he would be betrayed by it. The words came little by little. A compliment about her perfume. A comment about how the stress of work disappeared when they were together. A muffled laugh followed by a revealing silence. Then, the sound of the chair dragging, footsteps, murmurs. Gabriel had to close his eyes. It was no longer a doubt. It was a fact. One that pierced his chest like a hot spear. I didn't want to hear any more. He took his cell phone and walked into the house with his body shaking, not knowing where to leave the pain. He sat on the sofa and waited. He simply waited. About an hour later, Clara came in through the back door, smiling, pretending to be surprised to see him there. She said she thought he would be working late, that he had decided to take advantage of the free time to review some reports in the studio. He didn't respond. He just looked at her, and his gaze, filled with silent pain, made Clara take a step back. But she didn't ask anything. He avoided any physical approach. He went up to take a shower and go to bed early, as if that afternoon had been ordinary. Gabriel, in turn, spent the night awake. He listened to the audio more than 20 times. He went over every detail. The phrases spoken. The laughs. The breaks. The intonations. It was Clara. There was no doubt. And the man, he also recognized. The voice was the same as the video calls she received on her cell phone and which she always answered in another room. It was him. The director. The man she spoke about with so much sparkle in her eyes. The next morning, Gabriel woke up before the sun. He took a shower, dressed as if he were going to an important meeting and left the house without making a sound. I knew I wouldn't be able to live my life the same way. I couldn't pretend. But I also didn't want to confront her yet. I wanted to understand where everything was going, how many lies were hidden in that smile that seemed sincere before. He spent the day researching, organizing files, creating folders on the computer with dates, prints, recordings. I wanted proof. Not to humiliate her. Not yet. But to protect yourself. To ensure that when the moment came, he wouldn't just look like a wounded man, but someone who knew exactly what he was doing. At night, he returned home with his mind pounding. Clara was on the couch, watching some series, pretending to be normal. He approached, kissed her forehead, asked about the day, heard ready answers. And, inside, he began to draw the scenario of what would come next. It wouldn't be immediate. It needed to be precise. Clara could never imagine what was coming. And at that moment, he was sure that the betrayal was just the first layer of what he would still discover. Because something, within all of that, still didn't make sense. And the full truth, he felt, had not yet been revealed. That morning, the silence was thicker than usual. The sound of the spoon turning in Gabriel's coffee seemed strangely loud, as if the entire world was on pause. Clara, on the other side of the table, was typing on her cell phone while absently biting some toast. She talked about a company event that was happening soon, mentioned people's names that he had already accidentally memorized, but didn't really hear anything. Gabriel watched her with clinical attention, mentally noting every gesture, every hesitation in her gaze, every forced smile. The night before, he had finalized his plan. And that morning, it would all begin. For weeks, Gabriel prepared meticulously. He hired an audio technician to clean the recordings, edited the files so that they were clear, evident, indisputable. He printed records of the calls that Clara made during office hours, crossing them with the times when she was away from home. He gathered everything on an encrypted pen drive, protected with a password. And he arranged dinner. He invited close friends, Clara's parents, some of her work colleagues, including the director himself. The invitation was simple and elegant, a celebration of 10 years of marriage. Clara, when she read it, seemed moved. He opened a smile that for a moment seemed sincere. Gabriel held her hand firmly and said that night would be unforgettable. And it would be. The reserved restaurant was discreet but sophisticated. As the guests arrived, Clara circulated among them with ease, laughing, hugging, thanking them for the compliments on her dress, on her professional success, on the exemplary couple they formed. Gabriel watched everything from a distance, like someone watching a play about to reach its conclusion. He asked everyone to sit down after dinner, claiming that he would like to make a brief speech. The waiters collected the dishes and the wine was served in freshly shined glasses. The screen was turned on, the lights were dimmed, and Gabriel, with a calm face, walked to the center of the room. He began by thanking everyone for their presence, his wife's partnership, the moments lived throughout the decade. Clara, visibly touched, kept her eyes fixed on him, proud, perhaps enchanted by the sensitivity he demonstrated. Gabriel then changed his tone. He said that, throughout our lives together, we learn to look at each other with an almost sacred trust, and that sometimes this trust blinds us. He said that love, no matter how deep it is, can survive pain, but it can never survive lies. And then, without raising his voice, just with a touch of the remote control, he started playing the audio. The first words were strange. Clara's voice, in an intimate and affectionate tone, spoke things that should not be heard by anyone other than the recipient. The eyes turned to her. The male voice responded with phrases that made it clear that the relationship went beyond the professional environment. Gabriel remained still, without reacting, as the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Clara, pale, slowly stood up, muttering something about not being what she seems, but no one heard anything other than the sound that echoed from the restaurant speakers. When the audio ended, Gabriel simply said that, given all that, there was no more room for continuity. He handed her an envelope with the divorce request and left the room. The commotion was immediate. Clara, in shock, sat back in the chair, her hands shaking, her breathing hitching. The director, who was also present, stood up discreetly and left without saying a word. In the following days, Gabriel remained outside the house. Didn't answer calls, didn't respond to messages. He just continued living as if he were observing his own life from a distance. I needed to understand what to do next. But it was on the third night away from home that the surprise arrived. In the lawyer's office where he was dealing with the details of the separation, he received an unexpected visitor, a well-dressed woman, with a rigid posture and an indecipherable expression. She identified herself as Renata, compliance director at the company where Clara worked. He said he needed to talk. In hand, he had documents and a pen drive. Gabriel led her to the reserved room and listened, in silence, to the story that would completely change the course of what he thought he knew. Renata said that, since the episode at dinner, rumors arose within the company that put the board's reputation into question. Clara's name was in evidence, but not just for the obvious reasons. When they investigated Clara's access to internal systems more deeply, they found something that no one expected. She had sent confidential company reports to an external email several times in the last few months. The documents were related to a $1 million merger with a foreign company. At first, they suspected corporate espionage. But the truth was even more complex. When tracking down the recipient of the emails, they discovered that it was not the director, the man with whom Clara had the affair, but another name. An executive from a strategic consultancy who, coincidentally, had also approached Clara months earlier, on a course she took outside the country. A man who gradually approached her, praising her performance, saying that she deserved more, that she was wasted in that company. Gabriel listened to this as if he were trapped in a movie. What else didn't you know? What else had been hidden? Renata then told him that, when they confronted Clara, she denied the accusations. He said that he had sent the documents just to ask for guidance, that there was no bad faith. But the problem was that the files were not authorized to leave the company's network. Her situation was serious. Renata needed to know if Gabriel had anything more to contribute. If there were other records. And, reluctantly, he handed over a copy of the complete audios, including excerpts he hadn't shown the night of the dinner. That same day, Gabriel received a message from Clara asking to see him. Against what his pride dictated, he accepted. They met in a discreet café. Clara arrived with a haggard face, dressed simply, without makeup, with swollen eyes. He sat across from her and for a moment neither of them said anything. Until she, with a trembling voice, began to speak. She said she felt ashamed, that she never imagined everything would fall apart like that. That what I felt for him, even in the midst of mistakes, was still real. That he had lost himself trying to find himself. Trying to prove something to herself. Trying to feel alive. Gabriel remained silent. Until she touched on the real subject, she said that it all started as a harmless email exchange. That the man from the consultancy made her feel heard, valued. That the affair with the director was just a reflection of the emptiness he felt. But the real involvement, emotional, deep, had been with the other. The man she had given the documents to. She could no longer deny it. I knew I would be fired, maybe sued. I was desperate. Not because she lost her job, but because she realized she had lost the only person who genuinely believed in her. Gabriel looked into her eyes with a calm he didn't feel. He asked if she at least now understood the extent of the damage. She cried. He apologized. He said he would change everything to go back in time. He just replied that time didn't come back, but choices always took their toll. And, at that moment, Clara understood that her punishment would not be public, but intimate. He would have to live with the guilt every day, with Gabriel's absence, with the family's empty gaze, with the company's ruined reputation. The secret had come to light, but along with it, the real pain, knowing that, by trying to find herself in other hands, she ended up losing everything that really mattered. And what Gabriel would do from there, was still a mystery. The conversation in the café ended with a bitter silence, the kind that not only ends a dialogue, but seals the end of an era. Gabriel got up before Clara could touch him, collected his things calmly, cast one last look at her, not one of anger, but of an almost irreversible emptiness, and left, leaving behind not only the half-full cup, but the woman he had decided to no longer recognize. She sat, curled up in the chair, her hands shaking in her lap, as if she had just come out of surgery that didn't anesthetize anything. For the first time, Clara did not see herself as a victim of her needs, but as the author of her own shipwreck. Gabriel, on the outside, walked as if a weight had been lifted from his body, but inside him, everything was still pulsating with a mix of exhaustion and lucidity. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew exactly where he didn't want to go back. In the following days, Gabriel finalized the divorce process with technical coolness. He moved his belongings from the house they previously shared and temporarily stayed in a furnished apartment, while he looked for another place to truly start over. I didn't want the old furniture, nor the paintings, nor the memories that were embedded in every corner. Starting over, for him, wasn't just about changing address, but changing skin. He insisted that Clara keep the house, even though he was the legal owner, a gesture that confused even his lawyer. But the truth was simple, he wanted distance from everything that represented that phase. Including her. Clara, in turn, found herself isolated in a house that suddenly seemed too immense for her steps. The dismissal came faster than she expected. There was no room for justifications or emotional appeals. The scandal, although hushed up by superiors, spread discreetly throughout the company's corridors. She started to be avoided, the invitations disappeared, the looks were diverted. The man who had encouraged her to send the confidential documents never contacted her again. And the director with whom he had been physically involved was the first to deny any closeness beyond work. Clara discovered, cruelly, that for the men around her, she had been just a body in between their own ambitions. The family, until then protective, began to treat her with a painful distance. The mother, disappointed, avoided talking about the subject. The father, tougher, barely responded to messages. Close friends were divided between those who pretended neutrality and those who disappeared altogether. He was left with the mirror, conscience and silence. The same silence she had built between herself and Gabriel over the past few months now enveloped her like a prison. Tried contact a few more times. Not to win him back, there was no longer that kind of illusion, but perhaps in search of an absolution that she herself was unable to grant herself. Gabriel didn't respond. And that absence was the most eloquent answer he could give. Unable to find her professional footing and with her image damaged, Clara decided to sell the house. Each room carried fragments of the man she betrayed. It was impossible to walk from the bedroom to the kitchen without remembering the way he watched her while she drank coffee, the discreet jokes he made while washing the dishes, the lazy Sundays on the couch watching movies she always chose. She tried to convince herself that this was all just part of the routine, but she knew she was lying to herself. Gabriel loved her. And she destroyed it with her own hands. The house sold quickly. And, with the money, she rented a smaller apartment, in a more remote area, where no one knew her. He wanted to disappear without having to explain himself. Meanwhile, Gabriel had risen to his feet with silent elegance. He invested what he had in a new digital business, set up a small office and surrounded himself with professionals who valued ethics and transparency. He discovered pleasure in rebuilding something from scratch, in watching his own personal growth parallel to his professional one. I wasn't looking for new relationships. Not yet. But he no longer carried the bitterness of abandonment. I was alone, but not lonely. And it was on a random afternoon, during a meeting with investors, that he met Helena, a communications analyst with whom he shared ideas and, little by little, significant silences. There was no rush, no euphoria. Just a mutual recognition that there was something there that was worth discovering calmly. Helena was Clara's opposite in many ways, but that wasn't what attracted him. What touched him most was the fact that she didn't try to be anything other than who she was. She didn't seduce with calculated gestures, she didn't play emotional games. She was direct, sensitive, pragmatic and curious. When talking to her, Gabriel felt truly heard, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Little by little, they began to share coffee after work, then dinners, then long conversations that invaded the early hours. Helena never asked about her past, but Gabriel, over time, told her everything. Not in search of comfort, but because I wanted to start that new story without secrets. And when she listened, she didn't judge him or try to fix anything. He just listened, holding his hand with a silent firmness. Months later, on a walk along the coast, Gabriel received a message from an unknown number. It was Clara. The message didn't ask for a return, it didn't beg for another chance. It was just an apology. Sincere, short and without unnecessary commas. She said that she had lost everything and that she only now understood the depth of what she destroyed. Gabriel read it and took a while before deleting it. He didn't respond. He just took a deep breath and continued walking next to Helena, as if he had finally closed a book that had occupied too much space on his emotional shelf for a long time. Across town, Clara stared at a fogged-up mirror after a cold shower. That small apartment was now the only space she could call her own. There were no more invitations, promises or opportunities. Just the daily attempt to rebuild with what little was left. She tried to remain lucid, with a temporary job, without great intentions. There were nights when I still dreamed about Gabriel, when I woke up with my heart racing as I remembered the sound of my own voice being played in front of everyone. But in these dreams, she did not seek forgiveness. I was just reliving the moment when everything collapsed. And I learned, little by little, that repentance was not always accompanied by redemption. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all, that love, no matter how deep it is, does not survive where there is an absence of truth. That there are mistakes that, even if forgiven, leave scars that forever alter the relief of the soul. And that some people, even though they were everything one day, are not destined to be part of the after. Gabriel's pain became strength. Clara's emptiness, lesson. And, between the end and the beginning, only time would remain as a silent witness to what is lost when you betray someone you never stopped believing in. The weeks following the silence of the message left Gabriel with a sensation similar to that of crossing a long, windowless corridor, where footsteps echoed more than necessary. He no longer thought of Clara with the same kind of acute pain that accompanied him before, but with a kind of almost existential estrangement, as if, when looking at the past, he found himself involved in a narrative that no longer belonged to him. Even if there were memories, even if certain images appeared at random moments, like the curve of her neck as she slept or the exact way she rolled up the sleeves of a favorite blouse dash, the presence that previously dominated her emotions was now just a faint trace, like forgotten perfume on stored clothes. There was no more hate, nor compassion. There was only understanding, and that was perhaps the fullest form of letting go. Helena understood everything with an admirable intuition. She never forced conversations, but she also didn't stay away when Gabriel felt like talking. On the contrary, she was present in dense silences, in exchanges of glances that did not require explanations, in long hugs given for no apparent reason. He allowed himself this new connection without the need for immediate fulfillment, and it freed him from expectations. He began to see the idea of a future without the shadow of an unresolved history. The scars were still there, but they no longer hurt to touch. While Gabriel advanced, Clara slowly sank into an internal process that was as chaotic as it was lonely. The temporary job I had obtained at a small company was terminated after the trial period. They said she was too qualified for the role, but Clara knew there was something in people's eyes that saw her with suspicion, even without knowing who she really was. Maybe it was the restless way she spoke, or her constantly distracted expression, or even the way she avoided creating bonds in the environment. She had become someone who could no longer support herself emotionally. On days when she had no commitments, she would spend hours walking aimlessly, going into bakeries, observing people, as if she wanted to understand at what exact point on the path she had strayed from everything. On one of those days, sitting in a bookstore that she used to frequent before her fall, Clara ran into an old college friend. She was a woman who, in her youth, I admired for her integrity, someone who always had the courage to make difficult decisions without losing her tenderness. The conversation between the two was gentle, almost superficial, but there was a discreet tension, as if they both knew there was something unsaid there. At one point, the colleague actually asked how she was. Clara hesitated, smiled with teary eyes and replied that she was trying to find out. The friend held her hand and said that this was a start. And it was there, in that brief gesture, that Clara had the first spark of true impulse to get back on her feet. It wasn't immediate. The days continued to be difficult, but now there was a silent, almost timid desire to find some value in one's own existence again. She saw a therapist, for the first time, not with the goal of repairing her marriage or relieving her guilt, but to understand who she was before all that. She was confronted with her choices, with the mechanisms that made her sabotage herself, with the personality traits that led her to seek validation in the wrong places. For the first time, she allowed herself to come face to face with her most unprotected self, and it made her fall apart. But this time, unlike the previous ones, the collapse was not accompanied by self-pity, but rather by an almost physical desire not to repeat the same patterns. Gabriel, on the other hand, was being asked to make a choice that messed with his emotional comfort zone. Helena, after months of a solid and affectionate relationship, had received a job offer in another state. It was a unique opportunity, but it required immediate change and mutual commitment. She didn't pressure him, she said she would respect him regardless of his decision, but she made it clear that she would like to build something with him if he wanted to. Gabriel found himself faced with a new dilemma: follow Helena to a new beginning, without ghosts and with a love under construction, or remain where everything had happened, where he had built his pain and also his new stability. Doubt gnawed at him more than he expected. He spent nights thinking about whether he was ready to give his heart away again with the same blind surrender he had offered before. He was afraid of reliving mistakes, of carrying emotional baggage into a new relationship, of not being able to be fair to someone who clearly loved him for who he was now, and not for who he once was. I thought about Clara more than I wanted to in those moments. Not with nostalgia, but as a milestone. She had been the boundary between the Gabriel then and the Gabriel now. And wondering if moving on with Helena was an attempt to forget or a genuine desire to start over left him confused. The following week, he decided to travel. He took the car and drove without a defined destination. He needed to get away from everything to hear his own thoughts. He ended up stopping in a coastal town, where the sea was silent and the wind seemed to carry away the rush. He spent 3 days there, talking to strangers, reading old books, sitting on rocks by the beach, and writing letters he didn't intend to send. In one of them, he wrote to Clara, even though he knew she would never give it to her. He described everything he felt, everything he learned, and was grateful, not for the suffering, but for everything it forced him to face. He felt lighter when he finished. On the last night, he looked up at the dark sky and told himself in a low voice that he was ready. When he returned, he found Helena waiting for him at his house. She didn't say anything, just hugged him. Gabriel looked at her with the certainty of someone who had made a conscious choice, not driven by necessity, but by desire. He said he would agree to go with her, that he didn't want to miss the chance to experience something sincere again. Helena, with teary eyes, just said that she always knew he would come, but that she needed him to know for himself. And in that hug, Gabriel finally felt that everything was exactly where it should be. The same day he started packing his things for the move, he received an unexpected call. It was from the hospital where Clara's father had been admitted after a heart problem. His name was still listed as an emergency contact. Gabriel hesitated, but decided to go there. When he arrived, he found Clara at the reception, alone. She was thin, pale, but there was something different about her posture. She didn't cry, she didn't shake. He just looked at him with respect, as if he recognized there a man with whom he shared a life, and not a ghost he preferred to avoid. He approached, asked how she was, and she replied that she was at peace. He said that his father was out of risk, but that he had understood, in that scare, the importance of ending cycles with dignity. Clara was grateful for him going. He didn't ask for anything else. And in that silent goodbye, they both knew that, somehow, everything had come to the right place. Not as redemption, but as understanding. Gabriel left the hospital weightless. Clara stayed to accompany her father. And between them, there was just a different silence. One that didn't hurt, that didn't suffocate. It just existed. As proof that, even in the most painful stories, it is possible to achieve some kind of peace. Even if it's too late to turn back. Gabriel spent a sleepless night after that hospital visit. Even though he had left Clara behind on his emotional journey a long time ago, something that night disturbed him in a subtle but intense way. It wasn't about longing, nor about doubt. It was a more refined feeling, like closing a book that, although it had already been read, had left pages loose at the end. Seeing Clara in that state, present, serene, resigned and without asking for more than he was willing to give, awakened in him a type of reflection that he had avoided until then. For the first time, he thought not of the pain she caused, but of the woman she had become after everything fell apart. And in a way, it brought relief he didn't know he needed. It was as if an internal knot had finally loosened. In the following days, the change with Helena progressed naturally. The boxes piled up as a symbol of a new beginning, and between one sticky tape and another, they laughed about how ironic life could be. Gabriel maintained his routine lightly, although he knew that this moment of transition also required emotional vigilance. He didn't want to repeat mistakes, and more than that, he didn't want to take to Helena shadows that didn't belong to her. One night, as they were organizing books on the bookshelf in their new house, she took a longer look at him. He noticed. He sat down next to her on the floor and asked her what was bothering her. Helena took a deep breath before responding. She said she loved him, but was afraid that he was still, even if unconsciously, linked to another story. Gabriel looked into her eyes without hesitation and said no. He said he loved what they were building because now, unlike before, there were no idealizations, just daily choices. And that made all the difference. The new city brought them an unexpected lightness. Nobody knew Gabriel, there were no heavy looks or questions disguised as interest. He and Helena built a new routine between simple coffees, walks at the end of the day and professional projects that intertwined without invading each other's space. Everything seemed to be in place, until the unexpected happened. During a meeting at a technology company where Helena had been invited to consult, Gabriel was introduced to a senior executive who would also participate in the negotiation. As he reached out his hand, he immediately recognized the man in front of him. It was him. The same man Clara had sent the confidential documents to. The same one that had been the real pivot of the ethical and professional collapse that resulted in the destruction of her career. The handshake took half a second longer than socially acceptable. The eyes fixed. The executive hesitated, but maintained his stance. Gabriel, in turn, emotionally stepped back and focused on what needed to be done. After the meeting, Helena noticed her restlessness. He asked what was wrong, but he just said that it was too small a world. During the night, he told her the truth. He said that that man was more than a figure from the past, he was the direct bridge between Clara's choice and their ruin. Helena listened carefully. He didn't ask if he wanted revenge. I knew Gabriel wasn't that kind of man. But she made it clear that if he wanted to step away from consulting, she would understand. Gabriel replied no. That he needed to look at all of this head-on, no longer as a victim, but as someone who had survived. And now I could see things as they were, without the filter of anger or trauma. In subsequent meetings, the executive avoided any contact beyond what was strictly necessary. But on a project closing day, when they were momentarily alone in the conference room, Gabriel broke the silence. He said he didn't want explanations or justifications. I just wanted him to know that the price Clara paid for that choice was higher than any advantage he could have derived from it. And that, despite everything, she had survived. The man did not respond. But his silence was enough. Gabriel left the room with the feeling that he had finally closed a door that had remained ajar for a long time. Meanwhile, Clara continued to discreetly rebuild her life. I had obtained an internship position at an NGO that offered legal and psychological support to women in vulnerable situations. It was ironic, perhaps, but also deeply symbolic. Working there made her come into contact with stories of pain that she, somehow, understood on another scale. He started studying again and became interested in topics he had left aside. I no longer spoke about Gabriel to anyone. But sometimes, before going to sleep, I remembered the little things. Not with a desire to relive, but with respect for what he experienced. One afternoon, when he left the NGO, he found his mother waiting at the door. He was teary-eyed and holding an envelope. He said he had passed by a bookstore and seen Clara's name in an article printed in a specialized magazine about public policies. It was a small collaboration, but signed by her. Her mother hugged her like someone who finds a daughter after years of being lost, and in that gesture, Clara finally cried. Not because of recognition, but because, for the first time, I felt that I had become someone I could love again. Gabriel and Helena continued their lives at a different pace. They planned a long trip to the south of the country, a break to look at the world with different eyes. Before they left, Gabriel received a letter delivered by hand by a motorcycle courier. The envelope had no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was Clara's. He hesitated before opening it. The letter was not long. He just said that he had been the greatest luck in her life and that, even though she had lost everything, she could now understand what it meant to truly love. The letter asked for nothing. It was just a silent declaration of a closed cycle. Gabriel didn't cry, he didn't smile. He just kept the letter inside a book that he used to reread in moments of transition. I knew that page belonged to the past. And it was time to move on. The night before the trip, Helena prepared a simple dinner and opened a bottle of wine. He asked Gabriel if he regretted anything. He thought for a few seconds and said no. That even the pains that marked him had been part of the construction of the man he was now. And if I could go back in time, maybe nothing would change. Helena held his hand tightly and said she was proud of his story. Not because of the suffering, but because of the way he chose to get out of it. And there, among cutlery, soft music and the warmth of a new house, they both knew they were ready for the next chapter. Clara, in another part of the city, closed the computer after finishing a report. When he looked out the window, he saw children playing in the square. He thought about how cruel life can be, but also generous. She knew she would never go back to who she was. But now he had something he had lacked for a long time, conscience. And with it, the ability to no longer repeat your own mistakes. The phone rang. It was one of the NGO's assistants, inviting her to participate in a debate panel at a local university. Clara took a deep breath, accepted the invitation and hung up. For the first time, he had something to offer that wasn't illusion. It was experience. And that, she knew, was what was left when everything else fell apart. The chance to teach from what was lost. And maybe, just maybe, help someone not repeat what they once chose without knowing how much it would cost. Gabriel woke up before the sun that morning. The suitcase was already packed next to the bed, and Helena was still sleeping, curled up under the sheet, breathing with the tranquility of someone who doesn't expect storms. He got up silently, put on the clothes he had chosen from the night before, and went to the balcony with a cup of coffee. The trip would begin in a few hours, but his mind seemed to have already left. The still dark sky brought an unusual calm, and in that lonely pause, he thought about everything he had gone through to get there. There was no pain. There was no euphoria either. What lived in his chest was a silent maturity, the result of a journey that he would never wish on anyone, but that, for some reason, now made him capable of living more deeply. Gabriel was no longer the man who was betrayed. Nor what needed to prove strength. He was just a whole man. Hours later, the plane cut through the clouds while Helena slept next to him, with her head resting on his shoulder. He looked out the window and, for the first time in years, he felt completely at peace. The pain of the past had left marks, yes, but it had also carved in him a new capacity to love, without rushing, without demands, without fear. That trip wasn't just a fresh start for two, it was a silent celebration of a life that was rebuilt with dignity. During the days that followed, between small towns, unknown landscapes and deep conversations, Gabriel discovered a light love, which did not require scars as proof, but presence. On one of those afternoons, while they were walking by a lake, he told Helena about an old dream, to write a book. Not about its history, but about everything that isn't taught in schools, the pain of continuing, the value of silence, the power of a choice. Helena smiled and said that he had already written the best chapter of his life by choosing not to become like the pain he suffered. Clara, in another part of the city, was walking through the halls of the university where she had been invited to give a lecture. She wore discreet clothing, her hair tied up, her shoulders firm. She was seen with respect. People listened to her attentively, and that surprised her. She still felt, at times, out of place within her own trajectory, as if she didn't deserve that place. But with each story he told honestly, each time he revealed his own mistakes without trying to justify himself, he gained back a fragment of dignity. She knew she would never have the prestige she once had, but now she understood that this kind of recognition was fragile. What remained, what really mattered, was to be useful in some way. At one of these talks, a young woman came up to her at the end of the night and said that she had left an abusive relationship after hearing her speak. Clara smiled with moist eyes and, for the first time in a long time, she felt proud of what she was building. However, life still had one last act. A few months later, while organizing the NGO's files, Clara received a legal notice. The former director of the company where he had worked, and with whom he had been involved, was being sued for harassment by several former employees. Her name appeared as a witness in one of the cases, even though she had never reported it. Someone had included her testimony in a list of anonymous reports, and now, even without intention, she found herself at the center of a public scandal. The lawyer responsible for the case asked Clara to give a formal statement. She hesitated for days. He knew that if his name was involved, everything he was rebuilding could fall apart once again. But I also knew that silence wasn't fair to the women who were now asking for courage. At the hearing, Clara was firm. Yes, you talked about involvement. But it also detailed the context, the way it had been manipulated, the toxic environment and the veiled incentives. He said he didn't just want justice for himself, but for everyone who came after. His stance surprised everyone, including the press. For the first time, she didn't run away from her own story, and that was precisely what made her worthy again in the eyes of the public. Not because he redeemed himself, but because he stopped hiding. He received attacks, of course. The internet never forgives. But he also received support. And with that, a new opportunity arose. She was invited to write a monthly column on ethics and professional reconstruction. Accepted. Not out of vanity, but because I knew how necessary it was to give voice to real vulnerability. Gabriel read one of the texts by chance, months later, during a work trip. He recognized the writing. He didn't feel angry. No pain. Just respect. He smiled briefly, folded the newspaper page and went on with his day. That same week, he and Helena announced their engagement. It was a small celebration, just for his closest friends, on a late afternoon illuminated by the reflection of the lake where he had first said he wanted to write. There, among toasts and promises, he realized that he had achieved something that many desire, but few achieve, a love without ruins. A love that is not born of necessity, but of the conscious choice to be with someone completely. Clara, in turn, followed the news of the engagement on social media. He didn't cry. Nor did he feign indifference. Felt deeply. But not as someone who loses, but as someone who finally understands that there are loves that were not meant to last, but rather to teach. And she had learned. At the end of that night, sitting on her small balcony, Clara wrote the last letter she would not send. He wrote for himself. She said she was ready to let Gabriel live without taking up more space in her everyday memory. And, in that moment, he truly allowed himself to follow. Not in a hurry, not with euphoria. But with the awareness that his life could still be beautiful, even with so many cracks. And so, everyone found their way. Gabriel followed alongside Helena, with simple plans and full days. Clara built a new reputation not on what she had hidden, but on what she had the courage to face. Neither of them met again. But the history between them never ceased to exist, as happens with everything that marks the soul. The difference is that now, this story no longer weighs. It was just a final point. Written with maturity. In pain, yes. But also with truth. And now, tell me, what did you think of this story? What part moved you the most? Leave your comment, your opinion is very important to us. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the next stories. And always remember, this channel does not, under any circumstances, support any type of betrayal. Here, we believe that the truth, no matter how painful it may be, will always be more worthy than a lie disguised as love. Until next time.